The document hit the table with a sound like a gunshot, and every man in that railroad office froze. Charlotte Thatcher stood at the head of the long oak table, her dark eyes burning with a fury so controlled it was more terrifying than any screaming rage. Her finger pressed flat against the paper, and her voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "This signature," she said, "is a forgery." Harrison Vance, the most powerful rail baron west of the Mississippi, did not flinch. He was a man who had buried 2 business partners and bought a senator, and he wore his cruelty the way other men wore fine wool coats. He looked at Charlotte the way a man looks at a fly he's about to crush, and then he smiled. "Mrs. Thatcher, I understand grief does strange things to a person," he said smoothly, folding his hands on the table. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Elena Garfield, signed that document of her own free will. Her land now belongs to the Vance Continental Railroad. The survey crews arrive Monday." "Elena Garfield cannot write," Charlotte said, and the room went still as a held breath. She never learned. Her husband handled all their correspondence until he died. After that, she used a mark, a thumbprint, always. She lifted the contract from the table, turning it so the lamplight fell across the swooping, confident signature at the bottom of the page. "So you tell me, Mr. Vance, who taught a woman who cannot read or write to sign her name in such an elegant hand?" The silence that followed was the kind that changes things permanently. Clement Brenner stood near the back of the room, hired that morning by Vance's secretary to serve as a courier and general enforcer presence, a role he'd taken because he was 3 weeks out of a cattle drive. His pockets were nearly empty, and the job had sounded simple. He watched Charlotte Thatcher stand her ground against a man who could ruin her 6 different ways before breakfast, and something shifted in his chest like a tectonic plate moving deep underground. He had never seen anything like her in his life. He did not know it yet, but everything was about to change for him too. 6 weeks earlier, Charlotte Thatcher had arrived in the town of Redrock, Nevada, in the summer of 1882, carrying a leather satchel that held her entire professional life. She was 28 years old, college-educated at a time when such a thing for a woman was considered either remarkable or scandalous, depending on who you asked. She had studied law for 2 years at an institution in Philadelphia that, under enormous pressure, had begun accepting women in a limited capacity. She had not been able to complete her degree when her father's illness had pulled her back to Kansas, but what she had learned in those 2 years had become the sharpest tool she owned. She read contracts the way other people read novels, finding the plot twists hidden in subordinate clauses, sensing the villain lurking in ambiguous language, understanding the tragedy that lived in imprecise wording. It was a specific and peculiar gift, and in the frontier towns being swallowed whole by railroad expansion, it was worth more than gold. She had come to Redrock because her old friend from school, a woman named Martha Delaney, had written her a frantic letter. Martha's letters were always frantic, but this one had a different quality to it, a compressed terror, like a scream trapped inside careful handwriting. The railroad was coming through Redrock County. Contracts were appearing on kitchen tables. People were signing, and something was wrong. Charlotte had packed her satchel and bought a train ticket before she had even finished reading. Redrock in the summer of 1882 was a town balanced on the edge of everything. It had survived the silver bust of '79, rebuilt after a fire in '81, and now found itself squarely in the path of the Vance Continental Railroad's southern expansion. The railroad meant jobs, it meant commerce, it meant connection to the wider world, and Harrison Vance had made sure that every newspaper in Nevada understood this. What the newspapers did not print was the other side of the ledger, the ranchers losing land they'd worked for decades, the farmers whose water rights were quietly absorbed into easement agreements they didn't understand, the widows whose futures were quietly erased with the stroke of a pen they'd been coached to make. Charlotte stepped off the stagecoach into Redrock's Main Street on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday she had already discovered 3 contracts worth questioning. She set up a small office in the back of Martha's dry goods store, a table and 2 chairs and the leather satchel, and she began seeing people. Word traveled fast in a small town, and faster still when people were frightened. They came at first with shame and hesitation, holding their papers like evidence of their own foolishness, and Charlotte received each document with the same professional gravity, the same careful attention, making no judgment and asking precise questions. It was on Thursday afternoon that Alina Garfield came in. Alina was 61 years old, a small woman with hands like knotted rope and eyes that had seen everything the frontier had to offer and survived it anyway. She was the widow of Thomas Garfield, who had homesteaded his 300 acres east of Redrock 20 years before, and built it into something genuinely valuable, particularly valuable now, that it sat directly in the proposed path of the Vance Continental's southern line. Alina set a document on Charlotte's table and looked at her hands. "They say I signed it," Alina said. "A man came to my house. He was polite. He had good manners. He brought another man with him, a witness, he called him. They talked to me for a long time about the railroad coming, about how it would change things, about how Thomas would have wanted me to think about my future." She paused. "I told them I needed to think. I told them I wasn't ready to decide anything. And they said, of course, they would leave the papers for me to look over, and they left." Charlotte had already begun reading the document. "They came back the next morning," Alina continued. "Early, before I'd had breakfast. The polite man said that the chairman of the company himself had reviewed my situation and wanted to make me an especially generous offer, but it was only available that morning, that I had to decide right then." Alina's voice remained steady with the particular steadiness of someone who had already done all of their crying in private. "I told him I couldn't read it properly. I told him I would need to have someone look at it. He said there was no time, that the offer would disappear if I didn't sign that morning, so I told him I would make my mark." Charlotte looked up from the document. "Your thumbprint." "Yes, I always use my thumbprint. Thomas taught me that. He said my mark was as good as any signature, and the law agreed with him." Alina met Charlotte's eyes. "But that paper says I signed my name, and I don't know how to write my name. I've never known how." Charlotte felt the particular cold clarity that always came over her when she found what she was looking for inside a document. It was not triumph exactly. It was more like the satisfaction of a physician who has correctly diagnosed a dangerous illness, tempered entirely by the knowledge that the illness is still there and must be dealt with. "Alina," she said carefully, "when the men were in your house, did they ask you to press your thumb anywhere? Anything at all?" An ink pad, a separate paper, anything, Alina thought. There was a second page. He said it was a receipt. He said it was standard for them to take a receipt showing they'd left the papers with me the day before. I pressed my thumb to that. Charlotte set the contract down. "I need you to understand what I'm going to tell you," she said. "This contract carries a signature in your name, written in ink, a full cursive signature. You did not write it. Someone else wrote it, likely using your thumbprint as authorization to claim your consent, and then producing a signature to make the document look more formal and legitimate." She held Alina's gaze. "This is fraud, Alina. Plain and straightforward fraud, and we are going to prove it." Alina did not fall apart. She simply nodded with the gravity of a woman who had suspected as much from the beginning and asked Charlotte what she needed to do. What Charlotte needed, she quickly understood, was more than legal acumen alone. She needed access to Vance's records. She needed witnesses. She needed someone who could navigate the physical and social terrain of Redrock in ways she, a woman with a law satchel and no local standing, could not easily manage on her own. She asked Martha about it. Martha, without hesitation, said, "Clement Brenner." Charlotte asked who that was. Martha described a man who had been coming through Redrock for 3 years running, sometimes working cattle drives, sometimes doing short contract work. She described him as honest, which in Martha's vocabulary was the highest possible praise. She said he knew everyone in the county and they knew him, that he had a reputation for fairness that crossed the usual social lines, that he had stood up against a dishonest foreman 2 summers back and taken the consequences without complaint. She said he was currently somewhere between his last drive and his next job, probably at the boarding house. Charlotte considered this information for exactly as long as it took to finish her tea, then put on her hat and went to find him. Clement Brenner was on the boarding house porch when she walked up the street, and their eyes met across 30 feet of dusty Nevada air. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done genuine physical labor their entire adult lives, with dark hair gone slightly long at the collar, and the kind of face that has spent years in direct sunlight, weathered to a quality that made him look like he was carved out of something durable. He was reading a newspaper, which Charlotte noted with mild interest. She came up the porch steps and introduced herself without preamble. He folded the newspaper, stood up, and regarded her with the kind of careful assessment she recognized. He wasn't dismissing her. He was reading her, the way she read contracts, trying to understand what he was actually dealing with before he committed to an opinion. She respected that. "Martha Delaney says you're honest," Charlotte said. "In my experience, when someone says that about a person in a town this size, they either mean it or they mean the opposite. Which is it?" Clement blinked. Then, to his credit, he almost smiled. "I like to think she means it." "Good. I have a situation that requires honest help, and I'm prepared to pay for it. I need someone who knows this county, knows the people in it, and can move around without attracting the kind of attention that I would attract." She met his eyes directly. "Are you interested in hearing what it is before you decide?" He considered her for a moment longer. Then he gestured toward the chair beside his and said, "Sit down, Miss Thatcher. Let's hear it." "Mrs. Thatcher," she said, sitting. "I'm a widow." Something shifted in his expression, something quiet and careful. "My condolences." "Thank you. My husband died 2 years ago." It's relevant to mention because it means I understand what a woman alone faces in this territory, which is part of why I'm here. She opened her satchel and produced a document. "This is Elena Garfield's land contract with the Vance Continental Railroad. The signature at the bottom is forged. Elena Garfield cannot write her name. She has never been able to. But someone who works for Harrison Vance wrote it anyway and plans to use it to seize 300 acres of land that has been in the Garfield family for 2 decades. She laid the document flat on the small porch table. "I intend to expose this fraud in front of whoever has the authority to do something about it. To do that, I need evidence, witnesses, and someone who can help me gather both without tipping off Vance before I'm ready." Clement looked at the document for a long time. He knew Elena Garfield, had known Thomas before he died, had helped them with a fence repair 3 years back, shared a meal at their kitchen table, heard Elena talk about the land the way people only talk about things that are genuinely part of them. "What would you need me to do?" he asked. The partnership that formed over the next week was one of those arrangements that begins as strictly professional and becomes, incrementally and almost inevitably, something else entirely. They were both careful people. Charlotte because she had learned that careful was the only way to survive as a woman doing what she did. Clement because he was by nature a man who moved deliberately, who thought before he spoke, who had long ago decided that restraint was not weakness but the opposite of it. They met every morning at Martha's store and worked through the afternoon, Charlotte with her documents and her precise, architectural thinking, Clement with his knowledge of the county and the people in it, his ability to have a conversation with a frightened rancher that actually produced useful information. They were, Charlotte thought with some surprise, genuinely complementary. Not in the way of opposites attracting, but in the way of 2 different instruments playing the same piece of music, each doing what the other could not. Clement, for his part, was conducting a continuous internal reckoning that he would not have easily admitted to anyone. He had known many capable women. He'd been raised by one, had worked alongside others on homesteads and in towns across the frontier. But Charlotte Thatcher was doing something he had never quite witnessed before, and he found himself watching her work with a fascination he kept having to remind himself was professional interest. She read a contract the way some people read terrain, sensing the hidden drops, the false paths, the places where the ground gave way. She explained to him one afternoon how Vance's standard agreement contained a clause that surrendered mineral rights in language buried inside a long paragraph about drainage easements, so ordinary sounding that a person reading it carefully would assume it was about water and move on. She showed him how another document had two slightly different versions of the same page, the original buried under the copy, visible only when you held both up to strong light. She found a date discrepancy in a notarization that proved the witness couldn't have been present, because he'd been in the hospital in Carson City that week, a fact she verified by writing a direct inquiry to the hospital administrator. It was that particular discovery that broke through something in Clement. He'd been carrying a modest, well-managed admiration for her that he'd been telling himself was simply professional respect. But watching her hold two documents up to the afternoon sunlight streaming through Martha's window, her brow furrowed with concentration, her lips moving slightly as she counted days in her head, and then watching her face clear with the absolute certainty of what she'd found, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time and hadn't expected to feel again. He felt struck, completely and entirely struck. She turned to share the discovery and found him staring at her, and there was a moment, brief but unmistakably real, where neither of them said anything. "The notary," Charlotte said, and her voice was only slightly less steady than usual. "The notary was in Carson City." "I see that," Clement said, and then, because he was the kind of man who said what he meant when it mattered, he added, "Charlotte, that is extraordinary work." She held his gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that both of them would privately consider later that night in their separate rooms, carefully and with some bewilderment. "Thank you," she said quietly, and then she went back to the documents. By the end of the first week, they had assembled something solid. They had Alina's testimony, clearly articulated and consistent. They had the handwriting evidence, which Charlotte planned to demonstrate by showing 3 examples of documents Alina had marked with her thumbprint over the years, official documents that all bore the smudged blue-black ink of her thumb, none of which bore any cursive signature. They had the date discrepancy in the notarization. They had 2 other residents of Redrock County who had had similar experiences with Vance's representatives, who had felt pressured and had signed documents they didn't fully understand, and who were now willing to speak. What they didn't have was direct access to Vance himself, or to his office records, or to the specific individual who had actually written Alina's forged signature. That problem solved itself in a way Charlotte could not have anticipated, because Vance, who had heard that a woman was asking questions about his land contracts, decided to do the one thing powerful men almost always do wrong. He underestimated her. He sent a letter, delivered to Martha's store, inviting Charlotte to meet with him and his legal representative at his offices in Redrock on Friday morning. The letter was courteous and slightly condescending, the kind of courtesy that is really a warning dressed in good manners. It referred to her concerns as understandable, given the complex nature of railroad law, and suggested that a meeting might help clarify any misunderstandings. Charlotte read it and said, "He thinks I'm a grieving neighbor who has gotten herself confused over some paperwork." Clement, reading it over her shoulder, said, "Good, let him think that." She looked up at him. Their faces were closer than either of them had quite planned, and there was a brief moment of mutual awareness before Charlotte stepped back slightly and said, in a perfectly composed voice, "We need to bring Alina on Friday." "And we need someone at the courthouse first thing Friday morning," Clement said, "filing the formal complaint before we walk into that office." Charlotte looked at him carefully. "You've been thinking about the sequencing." "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said. It was entirely ambiguous and they both knew it, and Charlotte chose to take it at face value because she wasn't ready for it to be anything else yet. though some part of her, the part that had been doing its own quiet reckoning at night, was beginning to wonder how long she could maintain that position. Thursday night, they stayed late at Martha's store, going over everything. Martha brought them supper without comment, biscuits and salt pork and strong coffee, setting it on the corner of the table with the particular tact of a woman who had known Charlotte for 15 years and understood something about what was happening here, even if Charlotte didn't want to discuss it. After Martha had gone upstairs to her own rooms, Charlotte and Clement sat in the lamplight going over the documents one final time, and somewhere in the middle of that, the conversation shifted. It happened gradually, the way temperature changes at night, and then all at once. Clement asked about her husband. She was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to tell him, and then decided that honesty was appropriate. His name was Daniel Thatcher. He was a good man. He died of typhoid fever very quickly, 18 months after we married. We had 1 year of genuine happiness together and then 6 months of my watching him leave, and then I was alone. She looked at the lamp flame. I came west afterward. I couldn't stay in Kansas. Everything there reminded me of what was supposed to happen next that wasn't going to happen. Clement was quiet for a respectful moment. Then he said, I lost someone too, not a wife, a woman I intended to ask. She left the territory before I got around to doing it right. I was always working, always one more drive away from being settled enough. And then she was gone. He paused. I've thought a lot about what I was waiting for. Charlotte looked at him. The lamplight made the shadows in his face softer, and she thought that this was one of the most unexpectedly complicated situations she had found herself in since Daniel died. She had not come to Redrock looking for anything personal. She had come to do a job. And yet here was this man, sitting across a table from her in a pool of warm light, saying something so honest it almost hurt to hear it. What were you waiting for? She asked. The right kind of certainty, he said. Which is a foolish thing to wait for, I've since learned. Certainty doesn't usually announce itself. It shows up in the middle of something else. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the final document and said, We should finish this. Yes, he agreed. And neither of them said anything more about it that night, but something had been said nonetheless. Friday morning arrived clear and hot, the Nevada summer already throwing its full weight down by 9 o'clock. Charlotte dressed carefully. She wore her best traveling dress, dark blue wool, which conveyed seriousness without apology. She arranged her hair neatly. She checked her satchel 4 times, not from anxiety, but from the discipline of a person who understands that preparation is the foundation of confidence. Clement met her outside Martha's store at 8 o'clock. He'd arranged for his friend Albert Reyes, who worked at the county clerk's office, to receive the formal complaint filing, which Clement would deliver in person at exactly 8:30, while Charlotte and Alina proceeded to Vance's offices. They'd agreed on a signal, a specific time by which Clement would need to arrive at the Vance offices, which would give the complaint time to be logged before the meeting ended. He looked at her in the morning light and said, without ornamentation, You're ready. It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. I've been ready since I read Alina's contract, she said. And then she allowed herself one small, real smile, which Clement received with the expression of a man trying to remain properly focused on a very important morning, who was finding that harder than it should have been. Alina Garfield arrived in the street dressed with a dignity that was almost formal. She wore her late husband's watch chain across her collar, visible and deliberate. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had spent 40 years building something that belonged to her and who was not going to surrender it without a fight. The three of them walked together for a moment before Clement split off toward the courthouse. Charlotte watched him go, and something in her chest did a thing she recognized and hadn't expected, a kind of quiet pull, specific and undeniable. She turned back to Alina. Let's go, she said. Harrison Vance's offices occupied the top floor of the Redrock commercial building, which he had commissioned himself 2 years prior. They were the nicest rooms in town, and he had furnished them to remind visitors of that fact. When Charlotte and Alina were shown in by a secretary, they found Vance seated at his long oak table with two other men, his personal attorney, a sharp-faced man named Crawford, and a man in a suit whose role was not immediately obvious. Vance rose with impeccable courtesy and directed them to chairs. He expressed appreciation for their coming. He asked after Alina's well-being. He offered coffee. He was, Charlotte thought, performing normalcy with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times. She let him perform it. She said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes, allowing Crawford to lay out the railroad's position, which was that the contract had been executed in good faith, that all proper procedures had been followed, and that the Vance Continental was deeply sympathetic to Mrs. Garfield's grief and confusion, but could not regrettably void a valid legal instrument. Then Charlotte opened her satchel. She placed the first document on the table, then the second, then a third, each one bearing the clear, smudged thumbprint of Alina Garfield on official correspondence going back 11 years. Court documents, a land dispute record from 1874, a deed registry notation from 1878. All of them marked with a thumbprint, none of them carrying anything resembling a written signature. Alina Garfield, Charlotte said, in that controlled, quiet voice that was more effective than shouting, has never in her life written her name in cursive. She cannot read or write. This is not a circumstance of recent grief or confusion. This is the consistent and documentable fact of her entire adult life. She placed the Vance contract last on top of the pile. The signature on this document is not hers. Crawford began to speak. Charlotte raised one finger and he stopped, which surprised him enough that he allowed her to continue. Furthermore, she said, the notarization on this document is dated the 13th of June. I have here a letter from the administrator of the Carson City General Hospital confirming that your notary, a Mr. J. Purvis, was admitted to that facility on the 10th of June with a broken leg and was not discharged until the 19th. Mr. Purvis was physically incapable of notarizing this document on the date it bears. The silence in the room was the kind that precedes something irrevocable. And thirdly, Charlotte continued, because she believed in completeness, this contract contains a clause in its 14th paragraph that surrenders mineral rights along the eastern boundary in language designed to appear to be about drainage rather than minerals. I believe this clause was intentionally obscured. I believe multiple contracts in this county contain similar obscured language, and I believe this constitutes a pattern rather than an isolated error. That was the moment she placed her finger flat on the document, and that was the moment she said, "This signature is a forgery." That was where the story had begun, that cold and luminous Friday morning. Charlotte Thatcher with her finger on the evidence and Harrison Vance wearing the face of a man calculating rapidly. Clement Brenner arrived at the door of the office 9 minutes later. The secretary tried to stop him. She was politely and firmly overridden. Clement stepped into the room, and Charlotte felt something ease in her chest at the sight of him, which she noted and filed away to think about later. He crossed to her side of the table without asking permission and stood next to her, and the simple fact of his being there changed the geometry of the room in a way she recognized was both practical and something else entirely. "Mr. Vance," Clement said, pulling an envelope from his coat pocket. "There's a formal complaint filed at the county courthouse as of 30 minutes ago, citing fraudulent contract execution, forgery, and deceptive practice. Signed by 5 residents of Redrock County." He set the envelope on the table. "The county clerk has a copy. The territorial judge in Carson City has been notified by telegraph this morning." Vance looked at the envelope. He looked at Crawford. Something passed between them that Charlotte read clearly because she was watching for it. It was the look of men who have been very carefully exposed and are deciding whether to fight or accommodate. Crawford said, in the tone of a man buying time, "These are serious allegations that will require careful review." "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "They will." Vance sat back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. Whatever he had expected when he had invited this woman to his offices, it was not this, not this surgical precision, not this woman who had arrived with 5 years of evidence layered in a leather satchel, and the specific, unflappable confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "What is it you want, Mrs. Thatcher?" he asked. His voice had changed. The performance of courtesy was still there, but under it now was something real, the sound of a man who has recognized that he is actually, genuinely cornered. "Elena Garfield's contract voided," Charlotte said. "Her land returned to her possession without encumbrance. A review of every contract Vance Continental has executed in Redrock County within the last 3 years by an independent party. Restitution to any party found to have signed under fraudulent or improperly coercive conditions." She paused, "and the identity of the individual who forged Mrs. Garfield's signature." Crawford made a sound like a man who'd been startled by something falling. Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That last item is something we would not typically disclose." "Then I would suggest," Charlotte said, "that you speak with your attorney about what typically happens when a territorial judge receives a detailed complaint about forgery filed against a railroad company, and then decide how you feel about disclosure." The meeting lasted 2 more hours. Charlotte was precise, patient, and completely unmovable. Elena Garfield sat beside her the entire time, not speaking much, but present with a gravity that was its own kind of testimony. Clement stood or sat at Charlotte's other side, occasionally speaking, mostly letting Charlotte conduct the legal architecture of what was happening, because he understood clearly that this was her territory, and he was there to support it, not to occupy it. At the end of those 2 hours, Crawford had agreed in principle to all of Charlotte's terms pending formal legal process, with the explicit understanding that the complaint to the territorial judge would include a notation of cooperation. Vance signed a preliminary agreement to stay the survey crews pending review. And when they left the office and came out into the blinding midday sun of Redrock's Main Street, Elena Garfield reached out and took Charlotte's hand. "Thomas would have liked you very much," Elena said. Charlotte felt the sting of genuine emotion that she almost never permitted herself in professional contexts and blinked it back. "I think," she said carefully, "that Thomas would have liked you." Elena laughed, which was a sound like something old and painful releasing. "He did," she said. 40 years and he still liked me." She pressed Charlotte's hand once more and then released it. "Come have supper at my place this week, both of you." She said it without looking at Clement, but the "both of you" was entirely deliberate, and she walked away down the street with the bearing of a woman who has won what she came for. Charlotte and Clement stood in the midday heat, and there was a moment of mutual quiet in which both of them were absorbing the morning in their different ways. Charlotte's adrenaline was receding and leaving behind it the familiar post-confrontation exhaustion she always felt after a major engagement. Clement was feeling something harder to name, a combination of being genuinely shaken by what he'd witnessed and something else, something that was entirely about the woman standing beside him. "You were remarkable in there," he said. It came out differently than he'd intended, more direct, more personal. Charlotte looked at him sideways. "We did that together," she said. "No," he said, and his voice was serious now, the way it got when he was saying something he meant entirely. "You did that, I helped where I could. But what you did in there, Charlotte, with those documents, with that precision, that was yours." He paused. "I've watched a lot of fights, in courtrooms and out of them. I've never seen anyone fight like that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. A freight wagon was passing, raising a curtain of dust. The summer heat pressed down on everything. "Professor at college," she said, "told me that the law is only as powerful as the person who knows how to use it." He meant it as a discouragement. He was telling me it took years of formal training to truly command legal language, and he meant that I didn't have those years and couldn't get them. She looked at Clement. "I heard something different. I heard that the law is a tool, and any person intelligent enough to understand a tool can learn to use it." Clement looked at her for a long moment. "He was wrong," he said simply. "Yes," Charlotte said, "he was." Something in the air between them had shifted so entirely from the first morning. She'd walked up the boarding house steps that it was almost dizzying to consider. They stood on the main street of Redrock in the summer of 1882 with the dust and the heat and the sound of the town moving around them. And for a moment that was very nearly perfect. Neither of them said anything at all. Then Charlotte said, with the careful composure that was one of her most characteristic qualities, "I'm going to need to stay in Redrock through the formal legal process, several more weeks at least." "I don't have any pressing engagements," Clement said. She looked at him. "That would be useful." "Yes," he said. And they both knew perfectly well they weren't only talking about the legal proceedings. The weeks that followed were the fullest Charlotte could remember in a long time. The legal process unfolded with the deliberate, grinding pace of territorial legal systems in 1882, requiring correspondence with Carson City, the filing of formal documentation, the careful orchestration of witness statements. Charlotte managed all of it with her characteristic precision, building the case document by document, testimony by testimony, into something so thorough and well-constructed that when the territorial judge's appointed investigator arrived 6 weeks later, he spent 2 days reviewing Charlotte's work and told her, with an expression of genuine admiration, that he had never received a more complete preliminary filing. During those weeks, Charlotte and Clement saw each other every day. They worked together in the mornings. They walked in the evenings, sometimes with purpose, going to speak with a county resident about their contract, sometimes without, simply moving through the cooling air of the Nevada evening with the comfortable ease of two people who have discovered that they like being in each other's vicinity. They talked about everything, about the frontier and what it meant to live on it, about the particular injustice of the railroad's methods, the way that the language of progress and the language of exploitation were being deliberately confused, about their pasts, about Charlotte's father, who had been a schoolteacher in Kansas and had read to her every night until she could read faster than he could, about Clement's family in Colorado, his mother who ran a boarding house, 2 brothers who were ranchers, a sister who had married a doctor and moved to Denver. Charlotte told him about Daniel. Not just the loss of him, but the reality of him, the person he had actually been, the bookish, kind-hearted man who had loved her intelligence rather than being threatened by it, who had encouraged her to go further in her legal studies even when it inconvenienced their shared life. Clement listened to all of it with the quality of attention that Charlotte had come to understand was his particular gift, not just waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said. He told her about the woman he had not asked in time, a woman named Alice from a ranch outside of Laramie. He told it without self-pity, with the honest clarity of someone who has processed a thing fully and put it in its proper place. He said that he had learned from it what he'd said on that Thursday night in Martha's lamplit store. That certainty doesn't announce itself, and waiting for the right moment is how you miss the moment. Charlotte, hearing that again in the context of an evening walk with the sunset turning the Nevada sky into something almost extravagant, understood clearly what he was saying. She understood it and allowed herself to understand it, which was different from how she had handled it the first time. "Clement," she said. "Yes," he said. He wasn't asking what she wanted to say. He was simply agreeing to the whole of whatever it was. She stopped walking and turned to face him in the evening light. He was a good full head taller than her, and his face in the red gold of the Nevada sunset looked like something from one of those paintings that people carry across a continent because they cannot leave them behind. "I came to Redrock to do a specific job," she said. "I didn't come looking for anything else." "I know that," he said. "But something else has happened anyway," she said. "Yes," he said, "it has." "I'm not a simple person," she said. "I have strong opinions and I am set in my ways and I take my work with a seriousness that some men find uncomfortable." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've noticed," he said, "all 3 of those things. And for what it's worth, none of them present any kind of difficulty for me." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I think you should know that I am very seriously considering being in love with you." It was the most Charlotte Thatcher thing she could possibly have said, that careful, precise hedging, considering being in love, and Clement Brenner, who had been maintaining his composure very successfully for weeks, broke into a smile that was so unguarded and genuine that it changed his face entirely, like a lamp being lit behind a window at night. "I appreciate the precision," he said. "In return, I should tell you that I passed the considering stage about 3 weeks ago, and I've been waiting for you to catch up." Charlotte felt something break open in her chest in the best possible way, a loosening of something held tight for a very long time. "That's very presumptuous," she said. "Yes," he agreed, not sounding remotely sorry about it. She laughed. It surprised her how easily it came, that real and unperformed laugh that she so rarely heard from herself. She reached out and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers with a steadiness that felt, she thought, exactly like what it was. They stood there together in the Nevada evening while the sky finished its extravagant display above them, and Charlotte thought that this was the thing about life that she had not been able to plan for, the way that the most significant arrivals came from directions you were not watching. The formal legal proceedings concluded in late September. The territorial judge ruled in Alina Garfield's favor. Her contract was declared void. Her land was restored to her full possession. The Vance Continental Railroad, facing a detailed investigation of its contracting practices, settled with 4 other Redrock County residents, whose agreements were found to contain fraudulent elements. Harrison Vance personally avoided criminal prosecution by way of the political connections that powerful men always maintain as insurance, but his legal representative Crawford did not avoid it, and a junior associate named Marley, who turned out to have been the one who had actually forged Alina's signature across 23 similar documents in 3 different counties, was arrested in October. Charlotte was in the courtroom in Carson City when the ruling was delivered, seated at the table with the territorial district attorney, who had, after reviewing her filing, done her the professional courtesy of asking her to be involved in the formal presentation. She delivered her analysis of the document fraud with the same precision and clarity she had used in Vance's office, and afterward, the district attorney told her that he intended to write to his colleagues in 2 other territories to recommend her services. Clement was sitting in the gallery, watching her. He had driven her to Carson City for the proceedings in a rented buggy, a long 2-day journey that had been, in its particular way, one of the best 2 days of his recent life. They had talked the whole way, the kind of talking that happens when 2 people have already said the difficult things and are now free to say everything else. He had made her laugh 3 times during the first day, which he considered a personal achievement. She had read to him from a law periodical she was carrying, and he had followed the argument with enough intelligence that she had looked at him sideways and said, "You should have studied law," and he had said, "I think one of us studying it is sufficient," which had made her laugh a 4th time. In Carson City, they had stayed at separate hotels, which they had both privately found somewhat frustrating, and had both privately agreed was correct for the time being. There had been a dinner the night before the hearing at a proper restaurant, and Charlotte had worn her blue dress again, and Clement had found himself staring at her across the table with the slightly stunned expression of a man who has made an extremely significant discovery about the direction of his life. After the ruling was delivered and the district attorney had finished congratulating himself on a successful outcome, Charlotte came out of the courtroom and found Clement waiting in the hallway with his hat in his hands, and without either of them planning it, she walked directly into his arms and stood there for a long moment with her face against his shoulder, and he held her with the careful strength of someone holding something very important. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. They went back to Redrock for the final documentation and the wrap-up of Charlotte's official involvement. Alina Garfield did indeed have them both for supper, a long, easy evening in the Garfield farmhouse with good food and the particular warmth of a home that has been defended and won back. Alina told stories about Thomas that made Charlotte wish she had known him, and Clement added his own memory of helping with the fence 3 years ago. And by the end of the evening, all three of them were very comfortable together in a way that felt entirely natural. On the walk back to town in the full dark of the Nevada night, with the stars overhead doing the thing they do in Nevada where there are simply too many of them and the effect is almost beyond belief, Clement and Charlotte walked with their hands linked and talked about the future. It was Charlotte who raised it. Of course it was Charlotte. She said, "I need to tell you something about how I intend to continue living my life." He said, "All right," she said. "I intend to keep doing this work. I intend to go where I'm needed and read the documents that are being used against people who don't understand them. And I intend to fight the fights that need to be fought. It's not a stable or conventional life, and I won't apologize for it." Clement was quiet for a moment, walking beside her under the vast Nevada sky. Then he said, "I've spent 10 years doing seasonal work, driving cattle, taking short contracts, moving around the territory. I don't have a stable or conventional life either. The difference is that my work doesn't mean anything beyond the immediate job." He paused. "Yours means something real." Another pause. "I'd like to be part of something that means something real." Charlotte stopped walking and looked at him in the starlight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has thought about this and is saying it right, "that I would like to go wherever you go if you'll let me. I can be useful. I know the territory. I know how to manage things that don't involve reading contracts. And I would rather spend my life being useful to something that matters alongside someone who matters to me than spend it driving other men's cattle." Charlotte looked at him for a long time. The stars were excessive above them. The night air was warm and smelled of sage. "That is," she said carefully, "the most romantically pragmatic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I thought you'd appreciate the pragmatism," he said. And there it was again, that smile, the one that undid her composure in the best possible way. She stepped closer to him and put her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her palm, and looked up at him in the starlight. "Clement Brenner," she said, "I have finished considering." He brought his other hand up to cover hers where it rested against his chest. "Good," he said. And then he kissed her, there in the Nevada dark with the stars doing their extravagant work overhead, and it was exactly as certain as he had said certainty was when it finally arrived. Not announced, not prepared for. Simply there, undeniable and complete. They were married in Redrock in October of 1882, a small ceremony in Martha Delaney's store because the church was being repaired after a roof incident the previous spring. Alina Garfield sat in the front row and wore her best dress and the look of someone who has had the private satisfaction of having predicted something correctly without saying so to anyone. Martha cried, which she later denied. Albert Reyes from the county clerk's office was Clement's witness, and a young woman named Dora, who helped Martha in the store and had attached herself to Charlotte's orbit with the instinctive recognition of someone who has found a role model worth following, was Charlotte's. The minister was a practical man who kept the ceremony brief and meaningful. When it was done and Charlotte and Clement faced each other with the rings on and the words said, Charlotte felt the particular quality of rightness that she associated with a correct solution to a complex problem. This was the right answer, she thought. She was certain of it in the same way she was certain of a legal argument she had built carefully and thoroughly. It was not the certainty of a feeling, but the certainty of something deeply and genuinely known. Clement looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was specific to him, that combination of warmth and steadiness that was his particular emotional signature, and she thought again what she had first thought on the porch of the boarding house, that this man was worth his time. All of it. They spent the first weeks of their marriage in Redrock, while Charlotte completed the final administrative pieces of the Garfield case and two smaller cases that had come to her during the proceedings. The district attorney in Carson City wrote 3 letters. 2 other territorial offices wrote 1 each. Charlotte read them all with the calm of a professional receiving professional recognition, and something warmer underneath, the satisfaction of a person whose work has been seen clearly for what it is. Clement found work during those weeks helping a local rancher with some construction and fence repair, which suited him fine. He brought Charlotte her coffee in the morning and left her to her documents. He made supper when she forgot to eat. He listened to her think through legal problems out loud, asking exactly the right questions at exactly the right intervals, which she found unexpectedly valuable and told him so, which made him look quietly pleased in the way he always did when she said something direct and kind. They fought exactly once during those weeks, over a decision Charlotte had made to take a case in Silver Springs without consulting him first, which had required committing to a 2-week absence she hadn't mentioned until it was already arranged. The fight was honest and somewhat uncomfortable and entirely necessary, and it ended with both of them having said exactly what they needed to say and come to a mutual understanding about the shape of their life together, about how to balance her professional obligations with the fact that they were now a unit rather than two separate individuals making unilateral decisions. Charlotte had not expected that part, the adjustment of her deeply held independence to accommodate something she also genuinely wanted. It required more deliberate effort than anything else she did, and she applied herself to it with the same discipline she applied to everything. Clement met her exactly halfway, which she had known he would but was still glad to have confirmed. In November, they left Redrock and began moving. It was the life Charlotte had described on that evening walk, going where the work was, following the contracts and the frauds and the people who needed help reading the fine print of their futures. They traveled primarily by stagecoach and train, occasionally on horseback for shorter distances, with Charlotte's satchel always in her hands. New Mexico in the winter of 1882 brought a complicated water rights case involving 3 ranching families and a land company. Arizona in the spring of 1883 brought a series of homestead fraud cases so elaborate that Charlotte spent 3 weeks building the legal architecture before filing. She began developing a reputation that preceded her, traveling through the territories as the woman who reads contracts, the one you sent for when someone was trying to take your land with language you didn't understand. Clement was, in these travels, exactly what he had said he would be: practical, useful, knowledgeable about terrain and people and logistics in ways that made Charlotte's professional life significantly more possible. He was the one who knew which local officials were honest and which were not, who understood the politics of a small town before they arrived, who handled the physical realities of frontier travel with an ease that left Charlotte free to do the intellectual work. He was also, increasingly, the person she talked to about everything, and she was surprised to discover that she had not understood before how much she had wanted that. She told him this one evening in a hotel in Tucson, in a straightforward way that was very Charlotte. She said, "I did not know before you that I wanted a genuine intellectual companion. I assumed I would always be mostly alone in that regard." He looked at her over his supper plate. "And now I know I was wrong," she said, "which I find I don't mind admitting," he said. "For what it's worth, I didn't know I wanted someone who challenges me to think harder about things. I've become significantly more thoughtful about the world since September." "Is that good?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "It's very good." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. It was a small gesture, but Charlotte's small gestures were always deliberate, and Clement received it accordingly. In the late summer of 1883, they returned to Redrock for a visit. Alina Garfield had written to say that her land was producing well, and she had hired 2 young men from the county to help with the work, and she wanted to celebrate with the people who had made it possible. The visit stretched from a planned 3 days to nearly 2 weeks, because Redrock in the summer was quieter than it had been a year ago, the railroad having rerouted its southern line after the investigation, and there was something restorative about being in a place where things had turned out as they should. During those 2 weeks, Charlotte confirmed what she had been quietly suspecting for about a month. She was carrying their first child. She told Clement in Alina's kitchen on a Tuesday morning because she had decided there was no reason to wait for a special occasion when the news itself was the occasion. She said it plainly and watched his face. What crossed his face in the moment after she told him was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, a complete and total dissolution of his characteristic composure into something so wide open and full that she felt her own eyes sting with it. He stood up from his chair and came around the table and held her with a care that was also a kind of fierceness. And he didn't say anything for a long moment because he couldn't quite get there yet. When he could, he said, "Charlotte," just her name. But the way he said it made it enough. She held him back with the full force of what she felt, which was considerable, and thought that this was another thing she had not planned for and was extraordinarily glad had happened anyway. Alina, who came in from the back room in time to understand what was being celebrated, stood in the doorway with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes bright with the specific happiness of someone who has been through enough of life to understand the full weight of a moment like this one. "Thomas would have cried," she said. "He was a man who cried at good news. I always loved that about him." Charlotte laughed and Clement wiped his eyes with the back of his hand without any embarrassment, and Alina made a fresh pot of coffee, and they sat together in the Garfield kitchen for 2 more hours, talking about the future. Charlotte continued working through her pregnancy. There was a case in Santa Fe in October that she handled by letter, a series of complicated annotations she prepared from Redrock, while Clement did the interrogatory work. And they had developed by this point a functional system for long-distance case management that used the telegraph efficiently. She was thorough and careful, and made very few concessions to her condition beyond packing an extra cushion for stage-coach journeys, which Clement had suggested, and she had accepted with minimal resistance. Their son was born in March of 1884, in Redrock, in the room above Martha's store that Martha had insisted they use. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, healthy and emphatic about announcing himself, and Charlotte, who had endured the process with the same focused determination she brought to everything, held him afterward with an expression Clement had never seen from her before, something so entirely unguarded and suffused with wonder that he stored the memory of it in the way you store things you don't want to lose. They named him Thomas Daniel Brenner. Thomas for Alina Garfield's husband, who had built something worth keeping, and Daniel for Charlotte's late husband, who had believed in her before she had the evidence to prove him right. It was a name that held 2 different kinds of love, and both of them thought it was right. Alina, when she was told, sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice considerably smaller than her usual one, "Thomas would have been so proud." Martha held the baby and talked to him extensively about the importance of reading, which made Charlotte and Clement exchange a look that contained an entire conversation. The following years unfurled with the particular quality that characterizes lives that are genuinely full, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary losses and adjustments of frontier life, but with a forward momentum that comes from people who are doing what they are meant to do alongside who they are meant to be with. Charlotte's work expanded and became, in certain legal circles, genuinely well known. The Redrock fraud case had been reported in territorial newspapers and picked up by one Eastern publication that ran a piece titled "The Woman Who Reads Contracts," which Charlotte found somewhat reductive, but which did result in 3 significant case referrals from men who might not otherwise have reached out. She took cases in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and twice in California. She built a correspondence network with legal advocates in other territories who were encountering similar railroad fraud patterns, and she contributed formal written analyses to 2 territorial legal proceedings that set precedents for contract review standards that helped ordinary people understand what they were signing. Clement became, in the process of all of this, something he hadn't exactly anticipated: an investigator. His natural aptitude for reading people, for understanding the social terrain of a place, for finding the person who had the information you needed and creating the conditions in which they would share it, turned out to be a professional skill as genuine as Charlotte's legal acumen. He was, in the language of what they did, her eyes and ears in places she could not personally reach, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He took satisfaction in the work, in a way he never had in seasonal cattle labor, the satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they are genuinely good at rather than merely capable of. Thomas grew into a vigorous, curious child who had his mother's eyes and his father's constitution, and seemed to be inheriting the best of both their characters in small but observable ways. He developed an early fascination with the telegraph system, following the clicking messages with intense attention during office visits, which Clement thought was exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from Charlotte Thatcher's son. In the spring of 1886, Charlotte was pregnant again, and this time she told Clement differently. She waited until they were on an evening walk outside of Santa Fe, where they were living for a 3-month period, while Charlotte worked a complex land rights case for a community of Hispanic farmers whose irrigation rights were being challenged by a mining company. The evening was warm and the desert smelled of the recent rain, and she stopped walking and turned to face him on the path and said, without preamble, "Thomas is going to be a brother." The look on his face, the second time, was different from the first time in the way that second experiences of profound things are always different. Not less but deeper, more settled, suffused with the kind of joy that comes from knowing already how full a thing like this is. He pulled her close and held her, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. "Girl this time?" he asked. "I have no way of knowing that," she said. "I know," he said. "I just have a feeling." It was a girl. She arrived in November of 1886, resolute and immediately opinionated, with Charlotte's dark hair and Clement's steady gray eyes. They named her Elena Martha Brenner, for the two women who had been most present in the story that had brought them together: the widow who had refused to let her land be taken and the friend who had known to send Charlotte a letter. Elena Garfield, when she heard the name, received it with the same still gravity she had shown for the name Thomas Daniel. She said, "You didn't have to do that." Charlotte said, "I wanted to. Elena, you were the reason I came to Redrock. Everything that is best in my life right now came from that." Elena looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Charlotte, I've known a lot of people in 65 years. Most of them were ordinary in the best sense of the word. You are not ordinary, and I am deeply grateful that the railroad tried to take my land, because otherwise I might never have known you." Charlotte, who was holding Elena Brenner in her arms, looked at the woman whose name her daughter now carried and thought about the strange and specific grace of how things connect, the fraud that had brought her here, the contract she had read in a small office in a dry goods store, the man who had been on a boarding house porch with a newspaper. All of it leading to this room, this child, this life. "Come and have supper at my house this week," Charlotte said. Elena laughed. "Now you're saying it." "Yes," Charlotte said. "Both of us are saying it." In the years that followed, the Brenner family settled into a modified version of the traveling life. Charlotte's work now managed with a more deliberate geographic pattern that kept them closer to Redrock as a base for significant portions of the year, allowing the children a stable community and schooling, while still accommodating the cases that required her presence elsewhere. Clement's investigative work had become substantial enough that he had one formal professional relationship with a Carson City law firm that retained his services, which provided a steady income alongside Charlotte's case fees. Thomas grew up in the dry goods store and the law offices and the stagecoach stations and the telegraph offices of the Nevada-Arizona-New Mexico corridor, absorbing the world around him with an intensity that made his mother quietly and privately delighted. He learned to read at 4 years old, to Charlotte's complete absence of surprise, and by 7, he was reading her law periodicals. not understanding everything, but understanding more than was entirely expected. Alina Martha was, from the beginning, a person of strong will and very clear preferences, characteristics that both her parents recognized with a certain amount of rueful amusement. She was affectionate and fierce in equal measure, and had formed by age 3 a strong personal alliance with Alina Garfield that seemed to operate on some frequency that bypassed normal conversational age differences entirely. The old woman and the small girl understood each other in a way that Charlotte observed with quiet gratitude. The Garfield case, in the broader history of territorial law, became a reference point. Charlotte's analysis of the contract fraud was cited in subsequent cases across 3 territories. The pattern she had identified in Vance Continental's contracting practices was eventually the basis for territorial legislation in Nevada requiring plain language summaries in land contracts and the presence of an independent witness chosen by the signing party, not the company. It was not sweeping reform, but it was real and specific, and it helped people, which was the standard Charlotte had always held her work to. Harrison Vance continued to operate. Powerful men who have sufficient political insulation rarely face consequences proportionate to their actions, and this was true in 1882 as it was true in other times and places. Charlotte understood this with the pragmatic clarity that characterized her understanding of most things. She had not expected to end Vance. She had expected to stop him from taking Alina Garfield's land, and she had done that, and she had created the conditions that made it harder for him to do it to others, and that was what was achievable, and she was satisfied with what was achievable. What was not achievable she did not grieve for long. She moved on to the next document, the next person, the next fight that needed fighting. That was who she was. On an evening in the autumn of 1888, Charlotte and Clement sat on the porch of the small house they had built on the outskirts of Redrock. It was a proper house now, with a study for Charlotte and a workshop for Clement and a room each for Thomas and Alina Martha, and a porch that faced west so the evenings were spectacular. The children were inside, Thomas reading and Alina Martha doing something energetic that they could hear but not quite see, and the sky was doing the Nevada evening thing that never became ordinary no matter how many times you saw it. Charlotte had a document in her lap as she almost always did, but she was not reading it. She was watching the sky. "Do you remember," she said, "the morning in Vance's office?" Clement, beside her, considered. "I remember walking in and seeing you standing there with your finger on the contract," he said, "looking like you were made of iron and fire simultaneously." "I was terrified," Charlotte said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That's what impressed me." She looked at him. "That I was terrified. That you were terrified and you did it anyway," he said, without hesitation, without asking anyone's permission or waiting for backup. "You walked into that room and did it because it was right and because you could." He paused. "That was the moment, Charlotte, that specific morning, that was when I knew." She held his gaze in the evening light. "You never told me that. I'm telling you now." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the specific quality of being truly known by another person, which is one of the rarest and most valuable things there is. Then she said, "The moment for me was the Thursday night in Martha's store, when you said certainty shows up in the middle of something else. I didn't know it at the time. I understood it afterward." "That's appropriate," he said. "You always process things carefully." "I do," she agreed. "It's a strength." "Yes," he said, with that small, real smile. "It is." The last of the sunset was going down over the Nevada hills, turning the sky colors that had no names in everyday vocabulary. Inside the house, Alina Martha shrieked with laughter at something Thomas had done, and then there was the sound of feet, small running feet, and the front door opened, and Alina Martha came out onto the porch in her nightgown, flushed and delighted, and flung herself at her father with no warning whatsoever. Clement caught her, as he always caught her, without any apparent effort, swinging her up against his chest and making the sound of someone who has been completely ambushed by a small person. Alina Martha wrapped both arms around his neck and looked out at the sunset with an expression of thorough satisfaction. "Thomas says there are no dragons," she announced. "Thomas is correct," Charlotte said. "But there could be," Alina Martha said. "There could have been," Clement agreed. "In ancient times." Charlotte looked at her husband and her daughter in the last light of the Nevada evening and felt the fullness of what had been built here, not just the house and the professional life and the reputation that preceded her into new territories, but this specific and irreplaceable configuration of people who had found each other in the middle of something else. Alina's land returned to her. The fraud exposed. The document read by the right person at the right moment, changing everything downstream from it. Thomas appeared in the doorway, more dignified about the sunset than his sister but watching it nonetheless, and Charlotte waved him out, and he came and sat on the porch step, and they were all there together in the evening, watching Nevada do what Nevada did. "Tell me about the contract again," Thomas said. It was not the first time he had asked. Charlotte looked at her son. He was 9 years old and already had the focused expression she associated with legal reasoning, which she found both predictable and delightful. "What part?" she asked. "The signature," he said. "The part where you knew." Charlotte shifted her document to the side and turned to face him more fully. "A signature is a specific thing," she said. "It belongs to the person who makes it. It has their habits in it, their particular way of forming letters, the weight they put on certain strokes. And when you know that a person has never learned to make those strokes because they have never learned to write, then a signature appearing on a document in their name is not evidence of their agreement. It is evidence of someone else's crime." Thomas considered this with the gravity it deserved. "How did you know she couldn't write?" "She told me," Charlotte said. "And more importantly, every official document she had ever put her name to confirmed it." Evidence that is consistent over a long period of time is very powerful, Thomas. One document could be explained away. 20 documents all showing the same thing over 30 years cannot. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this in the methodical way he processed everything. Then he said, "Did they go to jail?" "The man who actually forged the signature did," Charlotte said. "The man who arranged it did not." That is a frustrating truth about how powerful people often avoid consequences for the wrongs they arrange, but do not personally commit. It is one of the things that I work toward changing. Thomas looked at her with his father's steady gray eyes in his mother's face and said, "I want to help with that." Charlotte felt the particular quality of that statement land in her chest. She looked at her son for a moment. Then she said, simply, "Good." Clement, listening to this with Alina Martha still occupying a significant portion of his lap, caught Charlotte's eye over their children's heads. The look they exchanged was the particular look of two people who have built something real together and know it. The look of people who are where they are supposed to be. Alina Garfield lived for another 6 years, long enough to see Thomas reading law books at 12 and Alina Martha dictating letters at 9, which she found extremely appropriate. She died in the spring of 1894 in her own house, on her own land, which was exactly as she would have wanted it. Charlotte was with her at the end, having been sent for when it became clear that Alina's time was short, and she sat with the old woman through that last night and held her hand and talked to her about Thomas Garfield, and about the land, and about what it meant to have held something real in your life and kept it. At the end, Alina looked at her and said, with the directness that had always been one of her great qualities, "You are one of the finest people I have ever known, Charlotte Thatcher Brenner, and I am glad that fraudulent railroad contract brought you to my kitchen table." Charlotte said. "So am I," Alina said. "Tell Clement he was right to go after you." Charlotte laughed, which she thought was a remarkable thing to do at such a moment and also entirely right. "I'll tell him you said so," she said. Alina died peacefully an hour before dawn, with the Nevada night outside her window, and Charlotte sat with her for a while afterward before going out to the porch where Clement was waiting, having driven through the night when Charlotte's telegraph came. He was there in the early dark, his coat collar up against the morning chill, and Charlotte came out and went directly to him, and he held her while she let herself grieve properly. For the first time in a long while, the way you grieve for someone whose time was full and right but whose absence is still real. They had the Garfield land properly managed and held in trust after that, per Alina's instructions, which left it to the county for use as a small agricultural school, something Alina had wanted for years and had arranged carefully in her will. Thomas Brenner, at 18, assisted with the legal documentation of the transfer. It was the first real legal work he had done, and Charlotte reviewed every page with him, and when it was properly executed she told him it was well done and meant it. Alina Martha, at 16, was already writing her own letters to legislators about water rights, which she had identified as the next frontier of the same fight her mother had been fighting since 1882. Charlotte read every draft and made precise notations in the margins, the way her own professor had done for her in Philadelphia, but with the opposite intention, not to discourage but to sharpen. Clement, at 52, was still the person who read terrain and people with the same accuracy he had always had, who made coffee in the morning and supper when Charlotte forgot to eat, who asked exactly the right questions during legal debates, and listened to the answers with the quality of attention that had always been his particular gift. He had some gray at his temples now, which Charlotte had noted when it appeared and then apparently decided she had no objection to, based on her continued behavior toward him. On a morning in the autumn of 1899, Charlotte Thatcher Brenner sat in her study in their Redrock house, at the table that was covered in documents, and wrote the introduction to what would become the first comprehensive legal guide to identifying fraud in frontier land contracts. She wrote it for the people who would never go to college, never have the specific combination of opportunity and determination that had put law books in her hands. She wrote it so that the next Alina Garfield, sitting at a kitchen table with a document in front of her, would have a fighting chance of understanding what she was looking at. It was published the following year. It was widely used in Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona. Charlotte received letters about it for years afterward, from farmers and ranchers and ordinary people who said that it had helped them, that they had read it and understood, that they had caught something in a contract they would otherwise have missed. She kept every letter. The life they had built together was not a simple one. It was full of the particular difficulties of frontier living at the turn of a century, of travel and climate, and the physical demands of a world that was still being worked out, of raising children with strong wills and independent minds who needed careful parenting to channel rather than suppress those qualities, of the ongoing challenge of Charlotte's work in a world that was still not entirely convinced that a woman should be doing it. There were frustrations and setbacks and moments of genuine difficulty. But there was also this: two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, in the middle of something else, in a town in Nevada where a rail baron had tried to take a widow's land. Two people who had recognized in each other the specific and irreplaceable quality that made the other more than they had been alone. The legal mind that could read a fraud into the light, and the human intelligence that knew how to move through the world and bring people toward a just outcome. Together, those two things had done something real. On an evening in the summer of 1901, Charlotte and Clement sat on their porch as they had sat on so many evenings before, watching the Nevada sky do its extravagant work. Thomas was 27 now, working with a law firm in Carson City that was very proud of him, and did not yet fully understand that it was his mother's legal philosophy they were benefiting from. Alina Martha was 24 and had recently been in Washington, of all places, testifying before a congressional subcommittee about water rights issues in the Southwestern Territories, which Charlotte had found extraordinary and entirely appropriate. The house was quieter than it had once been, with the children grown and living their own lives, but it was not empty. It held the fullness of what had been built there, the evidence of a life that had been genuinely lived. "I've been thinking," Charlotte said. "You're always thinking," Clement said. It's one of the things I've most appreciated about the last 19 years. She looked at him with that sideways look that meant she was deciding whether to be amused by him. She decided yes. I've been thinking about what we started in Vance's office, she said. In 1882, the complaint we filed, the precedent it created. What about it? Elena Martha's work in Washington is downstream from that, Charlotte said. The legislation that came out of the Redrock case created the framework that allowed her to argue her water rights case using the same precedent. Thomas is using contract clarity standards that we pushed for in those early filings. She paused. A fraud that happened to one woman, one forged signature, and it turned into a river. Clement was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Then he said, "That's what you always said the law was, a tool in the right hands." "Yes," Charlotte said. "And you were the right hands," he said. She looked at him. In the evening light at 57, he was still the man from the boarding house porch, still that quality of person she had recognized in the first 30 feet of distance between them. The gray was fully in his hair now, and the years were in his face in the way years get into a person who has lived fully, honestly, and without much shelter, and she thought he was the finest-looking man she had ever seen in her life. "We were," she said. "Both of us." He reached over and took her hand the way he had been taking her hand for 19 years, with the same steadiness that had never changed, and they sat together on the porch of the house they had built in the town where everything had begun, watching the Nevada sky in the last light of the summer evening. Elena's land was producing well, under the management of the agricultural school that bore the Garfield name. Thomas would be married in the spring. Elena Martha had a lecture scheduled in Denver for October. The legal guide was in its second printing. Harrison Vance had retired to California and was largely forgotten, as men who build nothing real eventually are. The fraud had been exposed, the widow's land had been returned, and in the middle of all of it, two people had found each other in the most unexpected place, at the most unexpected time, in the middle of something else entirely. Charlotte held Clement's hand in the Nevada evening and thought that this was the thing about certainty. It didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive on schedule or in the forms you had expected. It showed up in a boarding house porch, in a lamplit storeroom, in a railroad office where a fraud was about to be exposed, in all the small and large moments of a life shared with the right person. She was certain, completely, thoroughly, and gratefully certain. The sky above Redrock did what the Nevada sky always did, pouring out its colors in extraordinary excess, and Charlotte Thatcher Brenner, who had read a forged signature into the light and changed the course of things, sat beside her husband in the beauty of the evening and was, in every possible meaning of the word, home.